It's remote and isolated. It's riddled with terrifying dangers and disease, and there's little comfort. But man's quest for oil has become a passion, driving pioneers deep into the Caribbean jungle to drill for oil, to the Earth's heart, if need be. Mining, transporting, and refining oil becomes all-consuming. Oil means power, prosperity, and progress. If you strike oil, you've struck gold. The Earth is our most precious natural resource. It's bursting with minerals and ores, ours to take, if we know how to plunder them. Probably the most treasured natural resource in the modern world is oil. It fuels our transport. It rules our economies. It influences political society and shapes our lives. This new commodity lies hidden in our wildernesses and beneath our seas. Oil seeps to the surface from Cuba to Barbados and beyond. This is the story of oil and gas exploration in the Caribbean and the role played by Trinidad and Tobago in the world's quest for precious black gold. The story of its discovery begins nearly 500 years ago. It's the late 16th century. The first adventurers from Europe are heading across the Atlantic in search of the fabled El Dorado, en route to the east. In the vanguard of this new wave of explorers to arrive in Trinidad and Tobago is England's most famous sailor of the era, Sir Walter Raleigh.
Trinidad and Tobago were two islands that formed a very early part of the European expansion overseas. Walter Raleigh came here in 1595.
It's taken Raleigh months to reach the Caribbean, and his ships are badly in need of caulking. He's desperately seeking a source of tar to repair his vessels, making them watertight for their intrepid onward journey.
He stopped on the southwestern peninsula at the town of La Brea.
And as his men went inland, they discovered a natural lake of asphalt.
Raleigh writes in his ship's log, "At this point, called Tierra de Brea or Piche, there is that abundance of stone pitch that all the ships of the world may be loaden from thence. And we made trial of it in trimming our ships to be most excellent good."
He gave prominence and he let the world know that here in Trinidad there was such an excellent tar material. Subsequently, for centuries afterwards, was very widely used by Europe and North America.
And that's really the first historical reference that we have to hydrocarbon deposits in Trinidad and Tobago.
Through the next 2.5 centuries, numerous Europeans come and go from Trinidad and Tobago's shores. The Dutch hold the islands during the late 17th century before other colonial powers take possession. The rich source of tar is one of the main attractions for these seafaring nations. The tar bubbles on the surface of the pitch lakes in the interior, not far from their landing spot at Le Bray. But they have no idea how this treacle-like substance is formed, or how long the supply might last. The formation of oil begins with billions of plankton dying and falling to the seabed. Without being eaten by predators, plankton and other sea and land animals are buried in layers of sediment. Squashed beneath the accumulated sands, the Earth's core heats up the seabed to 100 degrees centigrade, which finally converts the dead flora and fauna, now millions of years old, to oil. As pressure builds, the oil takes the path of least resistance, worming through rock fissures on its journey to the surface.
When you take that sweet, honey-colored oil that we talk about, which is sweet crude, and you let bacteria attack it, it converts olive oil into treacle. It makes the molecules that are nice and short very long, which means that it can't flow very well. And if you leave that at the surface for a long period of time, the bacteria will convert the oil into what we all know as asphalt.
For the first 3 centuries of the known existence of oil in Trinidad, it is used in the form readily found bubbling from tar pits. Along the coast around Le Bray, tar is collected on the surface and boiled in huge vats. Tar caulking becomes an intensive activity.
There were many other Europeans who came, but no one of them really sought to explore either the tar sands with the asphalt or to look for oil until 1866.
An English engineer living in Port of Spain, Captain Walter P. Darwin, is convinced there's oil to be found inland in the Le Bray area. Raising finance, he establishes the Perea Petroleum Company and sets off into the interior. It's a stifling, grueling, and seemingly endless trek. No one knows how far they will have to walk, or whether they will meet success. Few have ever set foot in this land before Darwin. It's impenetrable jungle, bursting with wildlife and disease. The quest for oil underground has begun.
Captain Walter Darwin was my great-grandfather, and his wife, Mary, of course, was my great-grandmother, direct descendant. But he was first and foremost a pioneer. He believed that oil could be found in geologically sound formations below the soil.
Darwin knows that where there's tar, there's oil, somewhere deep underground. He just has to find the source and tap it before the oil reaches the surface and turns to sticky tar. But it's a gamble. He's prepared to risk not only his own future, but the lives of his men too, as they search feverishly for evidence of oil.
What stopped him in Arapero was the sight of natural oil seepages, oil coming up to the surface naturally without any human intervention.
The early explorers went for oil seeps, which was a pretty certain way of finding oil. And they required that the oil not be too light, because the very light oil is very volatile. And volatile oil you can't put in a wooden barrel because it would leak and explode. So they were very happy to find the original oil seeps and drill for those, or drill around them, and they just went deeper and deeper and deeper, finding the same kind of oil.
The conditions were horrendous. It was mosquito-ridden, there were snakes, it was just raw, virgin jungle.
Without roads or communications, the men are isolated. They must be self-reliant, hauling tools and essential foodstuffs to the site of their venture. All their other needs must be supplied from the natural resources surrounding them.
He had raised capital here on Trinidad on the local market to deepen the well.
He dug a well that went down to about 160 feet, and that was successful.
It's one of the earliest oil wells to be drilled in Trinidad. But the bore's gas pressure is so low, Darwin struggles to bring oil to the surface. He tries dipping for oil, but cannot bring up sufficient quantities to make it profitable. Any other man would be crushed by his failure, but Darwin perseveres. The climate is taking its toll. Darwin's men risk everything for their employer's ambition, but they are succumbing to the hard work and heat in the jungle. Finally, disease creeps into the camp. It shows no respect for its victims, killing laborers, and eventually, the boss too.
He was in the process of carrying his material down to the well, and he took in with what was known at the time as pernicious fever, yellow fever, of which he died. He succumbed. He was just too far out. There was no medical help. There was just absolutely nothing to help him with his illness, and he died right there on the location.
In the jungle, yellow fever is a leveler, picking off victims irrespective of status, wealth, or ambition.
He was taken after his death in a fishing boat with my great-grandmother Mary, his wife, and one person, and they rowed across the sea from Aripero into San Fernando, a trip that must have taken them the best part of a day and a night. Because he had a communicable disease, he was buried without ceremony in the San Fernando Pauper Cemetery.
Yellow fever lingers on a cadaver. The men interring Darwin's body are the last to put themselves at risk for this oil pioneer. Darwin is buried hastily, but his discovery at Aripero has started a new contagion: the search for black gold.
No one else took the risk of investing in oil in Trinidad, even though they knew that there was oil, but the problem was, first of all, the extraction of the oil, and secondly, the marketing.
Because he was firm in his belief that the oil wasn't only going to be found under the Pitch Lake and could be found anywhere that the geological formations allowed. I believe that people like Lelam and Rust were empowered by the belief that he had and his ability to prove his belief by producing oil to the surface in commercial quantities. He showed them it could be done.
Oil is becoming an increasingly important commodity as the Industrial Revolution reaches its height. It's a worldwide race to find reliable and abundant oil fields. Investment is a high-risk venture, but the rewards will be immense for the winner. The Drake well is drilled in Pennsylvania, but the exploration of oil in Trinidad has a head start.
The Darwin well set the stage for what would then happen in the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, when the pioneers such as Randolph Rust and John Leland would then again resuscitate the activities in Trinidad and Tobago.
Walter Darwin's drilling venture was based in the interior at Arapara, but the pioneers to whom he hands over are based at Guapo on the leeward side of Trinidad. And Guayguayri, deep inside the jungle towards the Atlantic coast. Today, it is a remote and wild area of jungle. In the 1890s, it's a hellhole chock full of dangers. Randolph Rust arrives in Trinidad in 1881. He's English and hopes to make money from oil, but he needs an investor. By serendipity, he meets John Lee Lum, also recently arrived from China. The two will make superb partners.
My grandfather was a very adventurous man and a very brave man, because he left his village in Sunway in Canton Province as a young man and traveled to many countries before he eventually came here to the island of Trinidad and Tobago.
Lee Lum is an entrepreneur. He makes his first fortune in Trinidad from investment in cocoa plantations before opening a string of Chinese shops which spread across the island. Importing and exporting goods makes his second fortune. John Lee Lum is now a successful and increasingly wealthy businessman.
He did so well, and the government paid such heed to his enterprise that they allowed him to coin his own money. He made paper money, he made metal coins, so that the Lee Lum coin from, I would say, the 1890s right into the 1920s was a very valid piece of coinage, a currency that one could use throughout the country.
Lee Lum coins are minted in Birmingham, England, alongside currencies destined for Russia, Italy, India and France. While Lee Lum takes the last decade of the 19th century to establish himself, Randolph Rust has been prospecting at Guayguayri. It's closer to the Atlantic coast than it is to the harbour at Le Bray. Rust realizes that efficient transportation to market is almost impossible without a large injection of cash.
Randolph Rust, from what I understand, was seeking finance for his search for oil. And my grandfather, I suppose, had the foresight to advance him money to finance this project.
Randolph Rust and John Lee Lum go into business together.
Their first successful wells were in the Guayguayri area on the far southeastern coast of Trinidad.
In 1901, Rust and Lum established the Canadian Exploration Syndicate. A year later, they sink their first well. The crude oil is extracted using a steel tube lowered on a cable suspended from a scaffold. It's a laborious process, and once the blister of oil is exhausted, the entire rig must be moved to a new site. After 3 months, Rust and Lee Lum have a well 310 meters deep in operation. It's a slow start, But by introducing steam-powered engines, they expand to 10 wells. At the height of production, they are able to produce 100 barrels of oil a day. It's a tremendous success, but they're operating on a minuscule scale.
Both Rust and Lelam, went into a boom period. And that is a period in which additional oil wells were opened.
Workers flock to the new oil field. They are paid in Lelam currency, to be spent in Lelam shops. Transportation of the crude oil remains a headache for Rust and Lelam. They are forced to use the jungle's network of rivers, linked by stretches of rudimentary roads. It's arduous, time-consuming and expensive. Like Darwent, their entire operation is exposed to the ravages of the jungle. Eventually, the geography and geology of the island defeat them. Too far from the coast without a reliable route to the port at Le Bray, they have exhausted themselves and emptied their pockets. They struggle on until 1907. Lelam returns to China, where he dies 10 years later. Randolph Rust stays on in Trinidad, convinced that one day sufficient oil will be drilled to make a future pioneer very wealthy. On the leeward coast, German immigrant Conrad Friedrich Stollmeyer encounters similar problems. In the 1850s, having already established an asphalt extraction enterprise at the Pitch Lake, exporting the tar through Le Bray, Stollmeyer now strikes oil on his estate in the Guapo area. Initially, he uses the Vance River to carry his oil to the coast, linking up with his export activities at Brighton Pier in Le Bray. But diverting monies into road construction in the interior pays off for this pioneer. Felling trees and digging roads in the humid jungle is slow going, but ultimately it achieves faster access to the harbour. At Brighton Pier, along with his tar exports, Stollmeyer can now also roll barrels of oil onto ocean-going ships, headed for the expanding markets in North America and Europe. Until now, oil has been used mainly as a lubricant in industry and as a domestic fuel. But an embryonic industry is set to soak up the world's oil reserves. The advantages of the automobile become apparent, and the need for oil, and therefore petrol, fuels a new rush. Suddenly, geologists like Arthur B.B. Thompson are highly sought after. An Englishman brought out to Trinidad, B.B. Thompson locates more reserves around Guapo, and in 1907, number 3 oil well is successfully sunk.
Of course, news of that discovery in the forests of Guapo went very quickly to number 10 Downing Street.
Being a colony, Trinidad and Tobago's natural resources belong to the United Kingdom. When the Admiralty in London decides to convert the Royal Naval Fleet from coal to diesel power, the British look to their Caribbean possessions for oil.
That was significant. And once the British from 1910 moved from coal to oil, then other European nations, seeing the success of this experiment, followed, as well as North America.
Between 1909 and 1912, 60 oil companies are registered, all prospecting in the south of Trinidad. In in search of the 20th century's El Dorado, black gold. Cocoa and sugarcane remain Trinidad's major exports, but anticipating the burgeoning energy industry is on the verge of ballooning, a fourth man, 20-year-old Mikey Hamill-Smith, a third-generation Trinidadian, appears on the horizon.
In 1909, he qualified as an attorney and started his own firm. He traveled the length and breadth mainly of South Trinidad, doing what people thought was crazy, and that is spending hard-earned money on buying subsurface mineral rights.
There are already sufficient players in the oil production game. So instead, Mikey Hamill-Smith decides to invest in ownership of potential oil lurking underground. It's a gamble that ultimately pays off. World War I in Europe is looming, and Winston Churchill's decision to expand the Royal Naval Fleet requires even more oil. Running on oil makes the fleet faster and more efficient. The need for increased production brings work and investment to Trinidad. Its oil industry now truly enters the 20th century.
All of a sudden, in the space of about just over a decade, becomes an important center, a major center for production of oil for use by the British Empire.
During the interwar period, Trinidad and Tobago's oil industry continues to attract overseas investment in its natural resources. At home, lots of money is being made, but it's not landing in the people's pockets.
The workers in oil and in sugar were becoming increasingly impoverished because the captains in the oil industry in particular were not prepared to share their enormous profits with the ordinary workers. In addition, it was a period of considerable tension for Trinidad and Tobago.
Attracted by the prospect of employment, workers from neighboring islands flocked to Trinidad. During the 1920s and 30s, the influx of people lowers the standard of living. Disease and poverty spread among the workers.
In 1937, it was estimated that the average lifespan of a worker in Trinidad, a laborer, was 45 years. And I think it was the sharpness of that economic contrast that angered the working class enormously. And therefore, the period from 34 to 37 in Trinidad were very, very turbulent years.
Uriah Buzz Butler is one of the leaders heading the workers' movement, striking for better conditions and the right to vote.
The conditions of the poor Indians and Negroes in sugar and oil, respectively, was nothing short of subhuman.
But another war is on its way, and with it, the potential for economic security.
Moving forward to 1939 to 1945, in the Second World War, again, Trinidad became very strategic to Great Britain and the United States.
As the tensions developed with Germany, then Britain began preparing for war.
By 1940, the islands of Trinidad and Tobago have become logistically important to the Allies in the war effort.
A lot of food came up from Argentina and from Brazil, going across the Atlantic to Britain. Trinidad was a strategic location for refueling those vessels.
In London, Sir Winston Churchill is caught between a rock and a hard place. With France now an occupied territory, the British Empire stands alone against her enemies. Churchill needs to bring the USA into the war, but in return, the Americans want access to Britain's overseas territories. In 1940, cross-Atlantic discussions between Prime Minister Churchill and America's President Roosevelt result in the signing of the Destroyers for Bases contract, which means the Americans win rent-free land leases on British possessions. And in return, the US transfers 50 destroyers to boost the Royal Navy's fleet in the Caribbean and Atlantic. The Americans can now build military bases in Trinidad. At Chaguaramas, they build one of the most important air bases outside the United States. It becomes strategically important for merchant Navy convoys collecting supplies to transport to Britain. The base soaks up workers. It's boom time for Trinidad and Tobago during the early 1940s. But when the war in Europe ends, the troops begin to return home. These men have fought for the mother country. Some have died in a war thousands of miles from home. It's 1945, and there's the first whiff of independence in the air. Native African percussion music has been part of the cultural background of Trinidad and Tobago for 3 centuries. But the music of slavery has become linked with rebellion and protest. With the prohibition of traditional bamboo stick instruments, the oil industry provides a new tune, readily available for anyone to play. Millions of oil drums have been produced during the war. Now they're transformed into the steel pan. Trinidad and Tobago has invented a new cultural identity, and the only new musical instrument of the 20th century. The new sound of Caribbean music goes hand in hand with the island's growing argument for independence. It's a refrain taken up by Dr. Eric Williams, an Oxford University-educated Trinidadian who returns home and where in 1955 he decides to put down his bucket. He forms the People's National Movement a year later. By 1962, the fight for independence is won. It's a watershed, not only for the island's history, but for the country's oil and gas industry.
Democracy means equality of opportunity for all in education, in the public service, and in private employment. Democracy means responsibility of the government to its citizens, the protection of the citizens from the exercise of arbitrary power and the violation of human freedom and individual rights. All that is democracy. All that is our democracy, to which I call upon all citizens to dedicate themselves on this our Independence Day.
There was a whole nationalist movement that said we must own our industries, that the commanding heights of the economy, both in sugar and in oil, were in the hands of foreigners. So people were saying we are free but very unfree. We are independent but very unindependent. And Dr. Williams and his government was, in a sense, forced to come to terms with the fact that we needed to have more and more control of the economy.
Dr. Eric Williams is the latest pioneer in Trinidad and Tobago's oil industry.
He's the father of the nation. He can do nothing wrong. And people just listen to his every word.
Dr. Williams is assisted by a handful of politicians and scientists. They have a huge job ahead of them to build a nation and an economy. Port of Spain's wealth stems from the early pioneers' efforts. It's been amassed over a century of exploration and exploitation of the country's natural resources. But it's their newly won independence that signals a new policy, the desire to put the nation's wealth in the hands of the people. In the late 1960s, the main oil company drilling offshore is Amoco. They're only interested in oil, and the byproduct, gas, they burn off. To Amoco, it's worthless. To Dr. Williams, it's the stepping stone to the country's rich future.
Eric Williams then said to them he will not allow the burning of the gas. Amoco generously offered to solve their problem. They said to the government, we will not burn it, but we'll give it to you. for nothing. An agreement was reached where all what we call the low-pressure gas, that is the gas that came out with the oil, would become available to the government at the point where the gas is. So the government of the day then was faced with a problem. We have free gas, 25, 40 miles offshore. What do we do with it?
But Dr. Williams can see the potential. By building pipelines, the gas is brought on shore where it is used to produce electricity. And that powers the expanding industrial estates along the coast north of La Brea. With a potentially limitless supply of gas, they can put it to many uses.
Certain obvious things initially, electricity, of course, which we knew, LNG, ammonia.
The cheap electricity powers the first liquid natural gas and ammonia plants. However, the possibility of steel manufacture catches Dr. Williams' imagination.
Basically, he said, where Cain has separated us, steel will weld us back together.
It's a life-changing slogan for Trinidadians. The African population has migrated to the cities, and new workers from the Indian subcontinent have replaced them on the sugarcane plantations surrounding Point Lisas. By producing steel on the same site, Williams can provide new employment opportunities for both ethnic groups, bringing them together in one industry, owned by the people of Trinidad.
So, with that kind of political will behind the use of our gas, the government had the wherewithal from the petrodollar to invest. And again, Eric Williams' driving force was exactly this. He kept insisting to me and anybody who was involved in this that the future of any country, and in particular a small country, lies in investment in the productive sector. The biggest challenge was persuading the population at large that this was to their benefit. Here you have a country that was basically agricultural. Here you have a country where anything big, refinery, drilling, well, producing oil, producing gas, who did it? Not us. It was the Shells and the BPs and the Texacos and whatnot. And for suddenly this little country with people like myself saying, oh no, we can do this as well, generated a lot of very harsh criticisms.
But the vision initiated by Williams and carried through by men like Professor Ken Julian and his team wins Trinidad and Tobago the prosperity it now enjoys.
Trinidad's oil industry must be seen in the context of the geopolitics of that age, the early 20th century to the mid-20th century.
As the oil and gas industry enters this latest phase of development, a highly skilled workforce is needed. Men and women trained locally by world-class engineers.
But as a professor, no one can replace you in a classroom. You can really influence not just the acquisition of knowledge, but how young men and young women think. My mission was to ensure that the engineers we trained at the university saw meaningful opportunities in whatever sector of activity that we got involved in.
The pioneers of the mid-20th century, their steely insistence that ventures like Point Lisas will succeed, and the energy they inject into this project not only builds for Trinidad and Tobago an industrial base, but it grows leaders for the future.
If you go through Point Lisas, the CEOs of all those plants, with very few exceptions, maybe one exception, all my former students. And that's the real legacy.
Today, Point Lisas is the site for the world's largest methanol plant. It's the latest development to take the island's gas and transform it into a product that the entire world needs. And it's produced by Trinidadian talent.
These things were done by and large by locals who had accepted challenges to improve themselves and rise to understand new technology and perform services that enhance the situation in the country.
The methanol produced at the M5000 plant is a truly global commodity. It's a key ingredient for modern life used to make electricity and biodiesel. It's involved in the manufacture of glass, paint, and plastic.
We have become the largest exporters in the world. So gas is significant.
We really are a very major player in the global energy industry despite our very small size. It produces the wealth that the country has. We're the big dominant economy in the region.
With oil and gas producing 90% of the island's exports and half the government's revenue, such intense industrial development is written on Trinidad's landscape.
It surprises people when they come to Trinidad. It's not what they expect to see in the Caribbean. It's different to Tobago. Tobago is that lovely sort of Caribbean idyll, the azure seas and the palm trees and the white sands. Trinidad is not. It's an industrial nation.
Every industrial power goes through a dirty period when pollution is ignored in favor of money. But like the rest of the world, this twin island state assumes 21st century responsibility for its industry's environmental impact. The days of foreign piracy are long gone. Anyone now who invests in Trinidad and Tobago signs up to the country's strict environmental policy. International investors are encouraged to remedy the disruption caused by their operations, with financial support for local enterprises that promote the rich diversity of wildlife, both on land and in the seas surrounding the islands. For the moment, it appears that the natural world and exploitation of natural resources are not mutually exclusive. But as industrial expansion is inevitable, for how much longer can animals and man coexist in this landscape? The need to expand production is already driving the exploration of oil fields that the early pioneers could only have dreamt of.
Trinidad is actually attached to the South American plate, which is continuous with Venezuela, Colombia, and all of those magnificent oil fields. The fact that we are sitting on an extension of South America is what has allowed us to have such a lot of hydrocarbons for such a little island.
The strip of sea between the islands and Venezuela is the next big adventure for today's pioneers.
The deep water is a new frontier for Trinidad. There have not been many wells drilled there. And basically we're going to find, or we're hoping to find, exactly the same oil that we have anywhere else, but it will have to be found in big volumes. If we find those big volumes, Trinidad will be very well off economically for a long period of time.
But the gas industry is changing globally with new discoveries being made.
Of course, there is the challenge of the shale gas internationally. That seems to be a big challenge for Trinidad. So the shale gas will have its impact on how we do business in the future.
Shale gas in the USA may be a threat to Trinidad and Tobago's traditional gas industry. But there are new oil reserves opening up around the globe, and the country is poised to take advantage of its long history in exploration in these new territories. Places like Africa, that has resources, but lacks the knowledge that Trinidad has built.
We can play a role in working with, I emphasize the word, working with those countries, benefiting from our experience here.
I believe that we have demonstrated to the world that though we are a small country, we have been able to punch well above our weight when it comes to the oil and gas industry for over 100 years.
And none of it could have been achieved without the nation's pioneers. Walter Darwin, who struggled with the climate and disease to be one of the first to sink a well on Trinidadian soil. Randolph Rust and John Lee Lum, who risked their fortune to develop reserves deep in the jungle. Conrad Stollmeyer, who realized that infrastructure and a route to market were vital for success. And Dr. Eric Williams, who carried the torch that fired the nation to a new level of development. These pioneers gave birth to an industry that became the bedrock of an economy, producing wealth and stability, and a first-class future for the exploration of hydrocarbon resources in the Caribbean.